Viltrox may have just dealt a serious hammer blow to the likes of Sony and Sigma with this latest full-frame lens release. Why? Well, you see, currently, the only 135mm option available from Sony is the G Master, which is very expensive for what it is. Then there's the Sigma 135mm f1.8 DG HSM, and as the HSM part of its name gives away, this is just one of Sigma's old DSLR lenses that they've redesigned to fit onto mirrorless cameras, and as a result, it's pretty heavy, slow, and there are a few image quality issues. But despite the fact that portrait photographers everywhere have been begging Sigma to update this lens for years now, it still doesn't look like we're any closer to that being a reality. Well, that might not matter anymore because Viltrox have beaten them to the punch, and this new release is potentially better than either of the options I've just spoken about, and it's significantly cheaper too, with a cost price at launch of just under $900. But for that price tag, is it actually as good as it sounds? Well, we'll obviously get onto that in just a minute, but for now, I do need to first state that although Viltrox kindly sent me a copy of this lens to review ahead of its launch, they have not paid me to make this video, and they have had zero input in the production, and they've not even seen this video, well, until now that is. So that means that all of the opinions expressed here are my own, based on my own experience using this lens for a few weeks. That said, Viltrox have kindly provided me with an exclusive discount code to share with you guys, so if at the end of this video you do want to pick yourself up a copy of this lens, be sure to check out the info in the video description below before buying anywhere else. So, considering that this thing is less than half the price of the Sony G Master, what compromises have been made in terms of features? Well, seemingly none. I mean, in terms of build and physical features, this is arguably the most feature-laden 135mm lens you can currently buy. It's even probably one of the best built. I would honestly go so far as to say that this is absolutely on par with the quality of anything developed or released by Sony. All of the dials are buttery smooth to rotate, and it includes all of the stuff you would expect to find, like an MF to AF switch, 2 customizable buttons, a focus limiter switch, and weather sealing, blah blah blah. But there are 2 things specifically that make this lens fairly unique. Now, just behind the main focus dial, you may have noticed a secondary dial which acts as a manual aperture ring, as you may have already guessed. But the thing that makes it interesting is that although this is actually an electronic fly-by-wire type design, as you can tell, it's still clicked, and it can also be declicked using this switch just here, which is pretty cool. But without any markings on the lens barrel itself, how do you know at a glance which aperture the lens is currently set to? Well, obviously, there's always the back of your camera screen, but you can also use this small screen here, which also includes focus distance information too. Now, as you can see, when I rotate the dial, the current aperture value is displayed here, and obviously this is a lot easier to see in low light than traditional barrel markings are. And if I rotate this dial all the way in a clockwise motion, I'll eventually hit the A setting, which basically allows me to adjust the aperture setting using the command dials on my camera instead. Now, if I was being super critical here, I kind of wish they added a separate lock button for this dial, because at present there's no way of keeping it locked into that A mode, and that means that if you accidentally knock this dial, it can sometimes spin onto f16 or some other random aperture value. Now, in fairness, I can't say that that happened to me all that often, but having a lock switch would just potentially eliminate it from ever being a problem at all. Now, one simple way to fix this that I came up with would be just to simply allow one of these custom buttons to function as a means of locking the current aperture setting, or simply enabling or disabling the dial's function altogether. And I'm assuming this would not only be a pretty easy thing to implement with a future firmware update or something, but it would also be a pretty good use for these extra buttons, because I've personally never found a consistent use for these things, and if you have, please let me know how you use them in the comments below. Or equally, if you've never found a use for them, just put in big capital letters, custom buttons are pointless. Either way, it helps paint a picture for everyone. Anyway, back to this screen, because admittedly, this type of thing is nothing new, because even in the world of 135mm lenses, Zeiss made this a feature on their version ages ago. So what makes this thing so different? Well, this screen can actually be slightly customized in a number of unique ways using the Viltrox Lens app, which is free to download from the Google Play or Apple App Store. Once you're logged in and you've connected to the lens wirelessly, you then have a bunch of customizable options for this lens, including being able to set the functionality of each of these custom buttons. You can also update the firmware of this lens using the app itself, which is super convenient, though I do wish they included some options to customize that aperture ring too. Now that would have been pretty cool to see, especially considering they've gone to the effort of making this an electronic design, but who knows, that might be added in a future update. Anyway, I'm getting too distracted because we are here for the screen customizable options. And as you can see, we have a few options here, including being able to customize the startup animation to either display written text, boring, or my personal favorite, a custom photo taken from your phone. Now, given the tiny scale of this screen, I figured that it would be the perfect resolution to display a photo of my beloved micro penis at a 1:1 scale. That's pretty revolutionary.
It's like someone glued an acorn to the bottom of my torso.
Now, fancy dick pic screen aside, how does this thing actually perform out in the real world? Because ultimately, that's all that really matters, right? Well, firstly, the AF on this thing is top class, super quick to respond and whisper quiet, which is a good start. I even found that when tracking a moving target wide open at f1.8, this thing really does not have any issues at all. Though one thing to bear in mind is that the minimum focusing distance for this lens is around 72 centimeters. So you will need to make sure that there's a good amount of distance between yourself and your subject if you want to get a sharp shot, but that's really nothing out of the ordinary for this type of focal length. And also, if you are planning on using this lens for video work, then unfortunately this lens does suffer from focus breathing, which might be something to note in the cons column. All of that said, in terms of overall image quality, this is pretty impressive. The photos I captured were tack sharp even when shooting wide open at f1.8, and the bokeh is nice and thick as a result of that nice wide maximum aperture and the large front element. Now, don't get me wrong, this lens is not 100% perfect, and unfortunately I did spot some signs of blue and purple fringing in areas of high contrast, like around these tree branches. And when shooting some text at an angle to test for longitudinal chromatic aberration, things got colourful. The good news though is that when shooting towards a bright light source, flaring is handled pretty well. Though of course this thing does come included with a lens hood in the box, which will certainly help to protect against that type of thing. Now, small imperfections I can personally get over, especially for a lens of this price, but there is one big complaint that I have that might be a deal breaker for me personally, and that's just how big it is. This thing is an absolute tank. It's not only large, but it's pretty damn heavy too, weighing in at around 1.3 kilograms or 2.86 pounds. And that makes it the heaviest 135mm option of the 5 autofocus options that we now have available for Sony E-mount.
I wash myself with a rag on a stick.
Which for me isn't ideal, particularly considering that these days photographers are favouring smaller and lighter gear. Now, I've been using this in combination with my A7C Mark II, and not only is this combo super front heavy, but it also makes it a little bit clumsy to hold. Now, admittedly, this isn't the perfect pairing for this lens and camera, so you'd be much better off putting it on a slightly larger camera with a bigger grip, something like the A7 Mark IV. Or you could simply just slap a big hand grip on the bottom. Either of those would work and certainly help to improve handling. But either way, when you compare this lens to the likes of the Samyang 135mm, which, just to be clear, is only a little bit over half the weight of this thing, I do have to question slightly why they made this lens just so gigantic. Plus, despite the Samyang's much lower weight, it still offers many of the same functions and buttons as this thing, besides of course the fancy dick pic display here. Now, unfortunately, I sold my Samyang 135mm a while ago, so I don't currently own a copy of it, so I can't test these lenses side by side. But I did review the Samyang lens way back when it first came out a couple of years ago, and if you wanted to watch that review, you can check it out up here. But if you don't have time for all of that, in a nutshell, the Samyang is a superb all-round performer and has less issues with chromatic aberration, and because it's now a few years old, you can pick one of those lenses up for around $140 cheaper than this Viltrox option. So if weight is a concern for you, then that might be the one to look for instead. But if you're not a complete simp like me and you regularly go to the gym to get swole, then the extra weight probably won't put you off. In which case, for the price, this Viltrox 135mm is an impressive feature-laden portrait lens that's certainly worth considering. Looks like it's over to you, Sigma. We're waiting.